Feeling is mutual, Tom.
Well, John, it just seems like yesterday when the so-called 12-day war with Iran took place. This was June 2025. Now, back then, much of the media and political class hailed a triumph. You know, they were citing the massive degradation of Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile capabilities in such a short period of time. So why is the United States now on the cusp of launching strikes against Iran just a few months later?
Well, I think what's happened here, Tom, is that the goals have changed somewhat, at least for the United States. What we were concerned with doing in the 12-day war, and the 12-day war ran from June 13th to June 25th of last year, we were interested, as were the Israelis, in destroying their nuclear enrichment capability. They did not have a nuclear weapons program, but they had a nuclear enrichment capability, which meant that they had the ability to make a weapon. They could enrich uranium if need be. And what the Israelis and the Americans did in that war was wreck a substantial portion of that nuclear enrichment capability. I would also argue that the Israelis were interested in regime change, and they pursued a decapitation strategy early on in the war. They tried to destroy the leadership of Iran in the hopes that you'd have a revolution, you'd have a new regime. They failed on that count. But there's no question that we did significant damage, we meaning us and the Israelis, to their nuclear enrichment capability. But here we are again.
Yeah.
I don't think that the Iranians' nuclear enrichment capability is the target, because there's just not much there. There may be a few places left over they can attack. But I think the principal goal here has to be regime change. And it's hard to see how the United States and the Israelis, even if they operate together, can affect the regime change. A decapitation strategy didn't work last time, and it's certainly not going to work this time because the Iranians expect it.
There was no congressional authorization of that 12-day war in June. If it's regime change that is the end goal now, surely the president would seek congressional authorization, just like President Bush did on the eve of the 2003 invasion of Iraq.
Well, President Trump doesn't believe he needs authorization to do anything. You want to remember that President Bush, when he went after Iraq in 2003, tried to get a Security Council resolution, UN Security Council resolution. And he, of course, went to Congress as well. But those days are long gone. And now we have President Trump, who thinks that he doesn't need permission from Congress, or certainly permission from the United Nations. So whether he does it or not is solely up to him.
Well, when the Bush administration launched the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and we talked a lot about this at the time, John, that war had something like 72% of the American people, according to Gallup. But all the available polling evidence here with Trump and Iran in 2026, it's only 21% of support for the American people.
Yeah, I think you're right, Tom. It's more or less the reverse. Back then, as you say, about 70% of the American public was in favor of going to war against Iraq. And by the way, that was a case where we launched a ground invasion of Iraq.
Yeah.
Here we're just talking about bombing Iraq, and nevertheless, 70%, roughly 70% of the American people are opposed. And I think, by the way, Tom, that precedent, the Iraq precedent, has an effect on how people today think about using military force against Iran.
What about an initial strike to force Tehran into a deal on Trump's terms? This is what the Wall Street Journal has recently reported. Would that actually work?
No, it wouldn't work. And it wouldn't work for two reasons. First of all, you cannot tell a plausible story how you can use military force, whether it's limited or not, to either affect regime change or coerce the present regime into accepting President Trump's terms. Um, but the other point is that the Iranians have said very clearly that if we launch a limited attack, I mean, they've read the Wall Street Journal, they know this scenario, they will retaliate immediately with a massive attack. So if we launch a limited attack and they retaliate with a massive attack, we'll go right up the escalation ladder and both sides will be blasting the living daylights out of each other.
Well, how might Iran retaliate?
Oh, they have three sets of targets that they can hit. First of all, they will go after Israel like they did last time. They have a huge number of ballistic missiles, and some of their best ballistic missiles they didn't use last time, and they promised to use this time. And you want to remember, as the 12-day war wore on last June, the Iranians got increasingly sophisticated in terms of their ability to penetrate Israel's defenses. And both the Israelis and the Americans began to run out of defensive missiles, which left Israel vulnerable. So Israel was very anxious to end the 12-day war back in June because it was getting slammed by Iranian missiles. So the first way in which the Iranians will retaliate is by slamming Israel with ballistic missiles. The second way they will retaliate is they'll go after American military bases in the region, which are vulnerable targets. Just think about the airfields where we have aircraft that are aimed at Iran. The aircraft are sitting out on open runways. So they'll retaliate against us. And then third, and maybe most importantly, they will shut the Straits of Hormuz, so they say, and they'll prevent the flow of oil out of the Persian Gulf. And almost everybody who's looked at this issue says this will have enormously negative consequences for the world economy, because roughly, 20 to 25% of the world's petroleum comes out of the Persian Gulf through the Straits of Hormuz.
Mind you, we've been here before, John, and you'd remember on the eve of last June, the last war on Iran in June, this is the 12-day war, many commentators, and I'm not just thinking of Tucker Carlson and the MAGA right, but also many distinguished foreign policy intellectuals, they were warning that a war with Iran would be catastrophic, especially, the points you made about the Straits, and American bases and soldiers. That didn't happen then. Why might this time be different?
You want to remember, just to go back to last June, that President Trump basically ended the war after 12 days because, as I said, the Israelis had had enough. But he also ended the war because he had come to understand that the Iranians were moving to close the Straits of Hormuz. And Trump understood full well that that would be disastrous. So that contributed to ending the war. But that was last June. It's a very different situation today. You're talking about the Americans launching a large-scale attack on Iran. And the Iranians have said, and they have a vested interest in doing this, that they will shut the Straits of Hormuz. They will pound Israel much harder than they did last time, which is a way of saying they will go after population targets inside Israel, not just infrastructure. And they'll go after American military installations, which they did not do last time. And they have a vested interest in doing this for deterrence purposes. They have a vested interest in threatening this for sure to convince the Americans and the Israelis not to attack. But if we do attack, they have a vested interest in coming after us as hard as they can to make sure that this never happens again. So I think there's a very good chance that they'll shut the straits. They may not. Nobody can be 100% certain in these matters. But I think most people believe that they will, and I certainly do.
It sounds like Iran here has a lot more capacity to strike back hard against the Americans than Saddam Hussein's Iraq did in 2003. And even then, like, if that invasion of 2003, just going back to Iraq here for a moment, that triggered chaos and civil war across Iraq. It tipped the regional balance of power in favor of Iran by allowing it to establish its Shia proxies to dominate in Iraq. And of course, it led to the eventual rise of the Islamic State Sunni jihadists. Haven't we learnt the lessons of Iraq, John?
Well, to some extent, we have learned the lessons of Iraq. Uh, and what I mean by that is that the Trump administration is not talking about a land invasion of Iran. You
Hmm.
want to remember in 2003, we had boots on the ground. We invaded Iraq. And furthermore, we talked about doing social engineering once we got into Iraq and removed Saddam Hussein and promoting liberal democracy. You don't see any of that here. What we're talking about is using air power, using missiles to affect regime change. And then we never talk about creating democracy in Iran.
Mm.
We just want regime change. We want a regime in place that will dance to our tune. So we have limited our goals and we have limited our means, most importantly, by not putting boots on the ground.
Yeah.
But then the question you have to ask yourself is, can you affect regime change without invading Iran? I mean, you
Yes.
did have to invade Iraq to make regime change work. Can you make regime change work in Iran without invading? And the answer is almost certainly no. And if anything, Tom, I think if you bomb Iran, you'll create a rally around the flag effect in terms of how the people or the body populace relates to the regime.
John, I suspect a lot of our viewers are very confused about all this because, correct me if I'm wrong, Washington's core demand has traditionally been that Iran just must not acquire a nuclear weapon. But it's pretty evident that US demands have shifted. They're imposing more maximalist conditions, if you like. So, zero enrichment, dismantling missile capabilities, ending support for Iran's militia proxies. What's going on here?
Well, the Israelis have long opposed the idea that Iran can have a nuclear enrichment capability because there's no question that if Iran can enrich uranium, it can build a bomb. So when you had the JCPOA
Mhm.
in 2015, this is the agreement that the Obama administration fashioned
Mhm.
with Iran. They were allowed to keep their nuclear enrichment capability, but there were great limits placed on it. So there was no way Iran could build a bomb. But this was unsatisfactory to Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israelis more generally. They did not like the fact that Iran had a nuclear enrichment capability. So what happened was when Trump came into office in 2017, he then, a year later, 2018, withdrew from the JCPOA. And he did it in alliance with Netanyahu because this is what the Israelis want. So here we have a situation today where we're still arguing about nuclear enrichment.
Mhm.
If we cut a deal, the Iranians are going to insist that they keep their nuclear enrichment capability. They're willing to accept significant limits on it today, just like they were in 2015. But from an Israeli point of view, this is just unacceptable. But to take this a step further and go in the direction that you were headed with your question, now, today, the Israelis are profoundly concerned about doing away with Iran's ballistic missile capability, at least those missiles that have the range to hit Israel. And you say to yourself, why is this the case? Well, the answer is quite simple. The Israelis know what happened in the June war, the 12-day war last June. They understand what those ballistic missiles can do to Israel. So they want to get rid of the ballistic missiles. But the Iranians, needless to say, not only don't want to get rid of their nuclear enrichment capability, they don't want to get rid of their ballistic missiles either. So you can see where we are.
I know. But what complicates thing here is What complicates things here, John, is Trump himself, because, we've talked about his instincts of restraint. He wants to avoid military interventions that risk dangerous escalation. And you've argued that if he was left to his own devices, he'd want to strike a nuclear deal with Tehran. So I suppose the question here is how on earth has Trump allowed himself to be boxed in?
That's a great question. I think that what happened here uh, is that Trump thought that when he put this massive armada in the Middle East and he talked tough, that the Iranians would throw up their hands and cave in, that he would get his way.
Mm.
Uh, Steve Witkoff has recently said that Trump is really quite surprised that the Iranians haven't caved. Uh, I mean, this is Steve Witkoff speaking.
Yeah.
Trump is puzzled. What happened here? This is the United States of America, the most powerful state on the planet. We threatened to, pulverize Iran, yet they're not throwing up their hands. What's going on here? So I think this is how he got himself boxed in. He just misread the Iranians. And by the way, Tom, I find it hard to believe that he misread the Iranians like this. The Iranians are tough hombres, and they have made it clear for many, many years that they're not giving up their nuclear enrichment capability. And why he didn't understand that they'd never give up their ballistic missiles and never give up their support for Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis is beyond me. But here we are.
He's getting contrary advice. I mean, he speaks to his ally, Erdogan in Turkey, the Saudis, the Sunni Gulf states who don't want another Iraq and a refugee crisis. They don't want another Syrian civil war. They recognize the perils of another major military intervention in the Persian Gulf. He's hearing that. But he's also hearing from, as you mentioned before, Bibi Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, who wants to escalate things. I mean, is that why he's also boxed in?
Sure. I think almost every country on the planet is opposed to this war, except for Israel. It's quite remarkable. The Iranians and the Saudis, and more generally the Gulf states and the Iranians, have historically had terrible relations. But the Iranians and the Saudis are talking, the Gulf states and the Iranians are talking, and they're all talking about how best to avoid a war.
Yeah.
And you want to remember, countries like Jordan have big U.S. air bases located on their territory, and the Iranians have made it clear that they're going to pound those air bases in places like Jordan. And if they shut down the Persian Gulf, as we were talking about before, that's going to have profound consequences for the Gulf states. So these countries all want to avoid a war. And then the Chinese and the Russians are opposed to a war for all the obvious reasons, but it's the Israelis who want to do it. And the Israelis have a huge influence in the United States. As you know, I believe that the Israel lobby has immense power in terms of influencing how all presidents, but especially President Trump, behave. So he's between a rock and a hard place. This gets back to what we were talking about before.
Yes. Well, you mentioned the immense power of the Israel lobby, and we'll get to that in a moment. But Trump was also, as you'd recall, John, sharply critical of Israel in late June when Israel violated the ceasefire. He called it a major violation, and he even swore, I think, at a doorstop outside the White House, and he said he made it very clear he was most unhappy with Israel. So how do you interpret that?
I have a very simple question for you, Tom. What was the follow-up?
Well, he failed to put pressure on Israel.
Yeah, I mean, he can bark all he wants, for a
Mind
day.
you, have you ever heard a U.S. president criticize Israel in those terms before?
I I think there have been some U.S. presidents who have picked fights with Israel,
Mm.
but in all cases, they backed off. I mean, I think George H.W. Bush is a prominent example of that. I think Barack Obama
Mm.
is a prominent example. But the rhetoric, as we say in the political science world, talk is cheap, right? The question is, what are you really going to do? And you could bark at Israel a bit, and then Miriam Adelson or somebody in the lobby will come and tell you what the facts of life are, and you'll zipper your mouth and you'll do what you're told. And this is what you see with Trump. It is possible, though, Tom. It is possible here that he will not attack Iran, and that he will do that in the face of great pressure from the lobby and from Israel itself.
Mm.
And the reason is he may realize that he has two terrible alternatives here. One is to cross the lobby, and the other is to attack Iran. And when all is said and done, he may conclude, I'm just speculating here, that it is better to cross the lobby, that attacking Iran would be disastrous for his political situation here in the United States. So it is possible that this will be an exceptional case where a U.S. president actually does something that Israel and the lobby does not want.
And he would cross the Israel lobby. Now, next month marks the 20th anniversary of your famous article that you co-wrote with Professor Stephen Walt from Harvard University. He's a guest on this program next week. And the article was on the Israel lobby. That was March 2006, the London Review of Books. And we talked a lot at the time about how this generated a lot of controversy. And this was the precursor for your famous book, The Israel Lobby. Now, at the time, Brett Stevens, who was then at the Wall Street Journal, he wrote,
No, there's no question that there has been a significant shift away from support for Israel, both in the Democratic Party, or to put it more generally, on the left-hand side of the political spectrum, and now on the right-hand side of the political spectrum. And of course, here we're talking about inside the Republican Party. I find it quite stunning what's happened over the past year. In terms of the criticism that's being leveled from the right at Israel. And you see this most clearly with Tucker Carlson today. But not only Tucker Carlson, Charlie Kirk, before he died, was moving away from his enthusiastic support for Israel and becoming a harsh critic of Israel. And he had lots of followers who were moving in the same direction. So if you read the Israeli press, as I do, you can see that there is a huge amount of concern inside Israel, and it's surely the case inside the lobby here in the United States, about how public support for Israel is, I think saying that it's withering away is too strong, but is significantly, it has significantly decreased since 2006 when we wrote the article. There's just no question about that.
Well, you remember Pat Buchanan, the Republican who ran for president. Can you imagine a disciple of Pat Buchanan running for the Republican nomination in 2028, criticizing Israel amidst his America First campaign? And could that resonate with Republican primary voters?
I can imagine a person like that running, and I can imagine that person attracting a lot of Republican voters. And by the way, you could make a similar argument with regard to the Democratic Party. The question you have to ask yourself is whether you think that that person, be he or she a Democrat or a Republican, would prevail in the primaries. I find that hard to believe, but I'm not somebody you can really trust on this issue.
Sure. So,
because I have a dog in the fight. I have a vet.
Yeah, that's right. But it's happening on both parties. I mean, this is the point, though. Let's go through this. So public opinion, American public opinion, especially among younger Americans, has shifted against Israel. That's pretty clear. You've got the deep divisions within Trump's MAGA base. We've just talked about that. Then there is Trump's instincts not to get involved in military conflicts that could spiral out of control. And then there's the US allies, the Sunni Gulf allies, the Saudis, the UAE, Turkey, and so on and so forth, advising against an intervention again against Iran. And yet we're heading into a possible conflict with Iran.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, you just do not want to underestimate the power of Israel and its supporters in the West generally, and in the United States in particular. I mean, most people find it hard to believe that the lobby could be so powerful that it could sway the United States like this. But it is true. There's no parallel in modern history. Steve and I made this point clear in the book. There is no case where a country like the United States gave unconditional support to another country. And that's what's going on here. The United States gives unconditional support to Israel. No matter what Israel does, we support it. This is truly amazing. Again, there is no other example in the historical record that even comes close to this. And you have to ask yourself the question, why is this the case? You can't make the case it's because Israel's a strategic asset. If anything, it's a strategic liability. I could lay that story out for you. And furthermore, you can't make the argument that we're doing this for moral reasons, given that Israel is an apartheid state executing a genocide. You just can't make that argument. Yep. It is the lobby.
The late legendary Congressman Lee Hamilton, you may recall back in 1991 when the lobby was putting a lot of pressure on President George H.W. Bush over the Israeli settlements in the West Bank. He said, quote, "There's no lobby group that matches it." And that's precisely your point. But let me just put the argument back to you, John, as we often do on this program. The defenders of Israel will say that since the revolution in the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979, the mullahs have had Iran in its gun sights.
You mean Israel in its gun sights?
Sorry, they want to have Israel in its gun sights. Thanks, John. And the other point to bear in mind, and this is the argument you'll often hear from not just the defenders of Israel, but the hawks in Washington. They'll say that, you know, nuclear proliferation in the Middle East, that if Iran acquired a bomb, Saudi Arabia might seek one from Pakistan or develop its own capability, then you'd have Turkey, Egypt, perhaps even Algeria, and they'd put to you, John, do we really want a region with 5 or 6 nuclear-armed states in the world's most volatile region, each at daggers drawn with the others? How would you respond to that argument?
I agree completely. It's in our interest, and it's clearly in Israel's interest, that there be no proliferation in the Middle East. And in fact, it's in our interest and Israel's interest that there be no nuclear proliferation anywhere on the planet. We do not want to see South Korea. We do not want to see Japan. We do not want to see Germany get nuclear weapons. And we certainly don't want Iran to get nuclear weapons, because I think that if Iran gets nuclear weapons, it's likely that other countries in the greater Middle East will follow suit. They'd be foolish not to. So I understand that logic. The question you have to ask yourself is whether you think going to war against Iran and pounding it mercilessly is going to make it unlikely that Iran gets nuclear weapons, or you think it's going to make it more likely that they get nuclear weapons. And my argument is that what we ought to do is try to refashion a JCPOA type agreement, have a basic rapprochement with Iran, and see that as the principal way to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons.
But even if Iran developed a nuclear weapon, couldn't a nuclear Iran be contained and deterred? I mean, the principal argument that distinguished foreign policy realists like yourself and Stephen Walt made in the lead up to the Iraq War was that a nuclear Iraq, and of course we now know they never had the WMD, but a nuclear Iraq could be contained and deterred, because Iraq knew that if they ever gave nuclear weapons to terror groups or used nuclear weapons, it would guarantee massive retaliation, perhaps annihilation. The principles of nuclear deterrence, couldn't that work against a nuclear Iran, John?
Well, 2 points. Just to reiterate, it is in our interest to make sure that Iran does not acquire nuclear weapons. Number 2, if Iran does acquire nuclear weapons, it will make for a more peaceful Middle East. Mm-hmm. If Iran has nuclear weapons, the United States and Israel will not be threatening to attack it the way we are today, because we would understand full well that Iran has nuclear weapons. Then you say to yourself, well, John, if you're making that argument, shouldn't we be hopeful that Iran acquires a nuclear weapon? And the answer is no. And why is that the case? The answer is you can never be 100% certain that those nuclear weapons won't be used. It's highly unlikely that those nuclear weapons will be used. It's highly likely that we'll be able to contain Iran, even if it's nuclear armed. But the point is, Tom, you can never be 100% certain. And given the consequences of a nuclear war, it's just better to avoid the possibility that Iran would end up using its nuclear weapons. So that's why we go to great lengths, and that's why the Israelis want to go to great lengths, and quite correctly from their point of view, to prevent Iran from having a nuclear deterrent.
And add to that Iran's vulnerabilities. Now, on this program just recently, John, Vali Nasser from the Johns Hopkins School of International Relations in Washington, Joshua Landis from the University of Oklahoma, these are arguably two of the world's leading experts on Iran and Syria. And they recognize that the Islamic Republic is really on the back foot. And I want to put to you what they were actually acknowledging to me. They cited Hezbollah's humiliation in Lebanon, assassinations of senior militia leaders, the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria, repeated Israeli strikes on the Houthis in Yemen, US and Israeli attacks on Iranian nuclear infrastructure, a collapsing economy, and all those protests against Iran in January that led to the deaths of thousands of innocent Iranians. So you don't want to respond to each and every one of those concerns, but doesn't that indicate that Iran is exceedingly vulnerable right now?
Let's assume all those things are true. Explain to me, Tom, why it's exceedingly vulnerable. You, Tom Switzer, have the American military and the Israeli military, if you want, at your fingertips. And all of those things that you say about Iran are true. Tell me the story as to how you're going to use the American military to get the particular end that you desire. What's your story?
Well, I suppose the counter-argument would be that because Iran's Shia crescent, this is the so-called axis of resistance, the Hamas, Hezbollah, they've been badly humiliated over the course of the last 2 or so years, and that would make it easier for a campaign of regime change. That's what your critics would put to you, John.
Now, look, the thing is, Tom, Hezbollah has not been destroyed. Hamas has not been destroyed. And the reason that the Israelis want us to get Iran to cease supporting Hezbollah and Hamas is that they understand that those two groups have not been defeated. They're rearming, and the problem for Israel has not gone away. That's what's going on here. But the question is, given that Hezbollah, Hamas have been weakened, given that Iran has been weakened, and very importantly, given that Syria has fallen, right, there is no question that Iran is not in a great position. But the question I raised with you is, so what? How does that affect your ability as an American policymaker or an Israeli policymaker to use military force to achieve a meaningful objective that solves these different problems that the Israelis want us to solve, right? The problem here, Tom, is that there's no military solution. The idea that you can use air power alone or air power plus missiles to wreck Iran and create regime change. This is delusional, in my opinion. There's no way you can do that. So I think the story you just told doesn't matter very much.
Okay. So if there's no military solution to the Iran problem, and Trump does escalate a war with Iran and things do spiral out of control, which is obviously not inconceivable. I mean, all wars are fraught with the danger of unintended consequences, as you well know. What does all this mean politically for Trump in the lead up to November's midterm elections? I mean, his poll numbers are already very low. What does all this mean in the lead up to November, John?
It's a potential disaster. And now the newspaper stories are coming out here in the United States that his political advisors are telling him, don't do this, because they believe that what you said is true. So you definitely have hawks in the United States, and this is certainly people who are, connected with the lobby, who are pushing hard to do this. John Bolton, Lindsey Graham, these people have never seen a war they didn't want to fight. And if Israel wants a war, they're, squarely behind it. But people who have thought long and hard about what you can do with military force, and then married that to the political consequences of not achieving your objectives, understand full well that Trump could get himself into a lot of trouble. And as you pointed out, he's already in trouble in the polls.
Well, let's talk about Trump before we conclude this exchange, John. Now, you would be aware that after the Supreme Court ruled against Donald Trump's tariffs, he went out of his way to call the 6 justices, and of course 3 of them were Republican appointees, he called them very unpatriotic, he called them fools, and the Wall Street Journal, they said his rant in response to his tariff defeat was arguably the worst moment of his presidency. What's going on here?
Well, the truth is that this is vintage Donald Trump. Donald Trump has virtually no respect for institutions, whether they're international institutions or domestic institutions like the Constitution or the Supreme Court. And he has virtually no respect for rules and law, whether it's international law, international rules, international norms, or domestic rules and laws. And here you have the Supreme Court of the United States, one of our most venerable institutions, making a judicious judgment on a controversial issue, and doing this in a very respectful and rational legal way. And because Trump lost, he says terrible things. He says things that undermine the legitimacy of, one of our most cherished institutions. And if you're interested in the future of liberal democracy, which I think all Americans should be, this kind of behavior is reprehensible. And I agree with the Wall Street Journal. And as you know, Tom, I rarely ever agree with the Wall Street Journal on the issues we talk about.
But the Wall Street Journal does publish Peggy Noonan, as you know, a former Reagan speechwriter, and she is among many commentators who say that, Trump's growing more erratic as his poll numbers fall and his policies run into trouble. I mean, John, to what extent do you think age here matters? Because Trump is nearly 80 years of age.
Yeah, he'll be June 14th of this year, which is not too far off. He'll be 80 years old. I think there's no question, Tom, that on all of us, and you don't feel this very much because you're just a young guy, but for an old guy like me, and an old guy like Donald Trump, I'm sad to say I'm only 2 years behind him age-wise. But for us, there's no way you don't feel the wear and tear of age, right? You just feel it. The interesting question is how much age accounts for his irascibility, for his slowing down. It's impossible to tell with any precision. But I do believe the wear and tear of that job is enormous. I always remember a book that came out many, many years ago when I was a graduate student about Dwight Eisenhower. And it had 8 pictures of Eisenhower on the cover for all 8 years that he was president. And if you looked at Dwight Eisenhower in 1953, his first year, and you compared what he looked like by 1961, right? And you could look at all the pictures and see the aging process. You saw that the wear and tear on him was just enormous. And this has to be true with regard to Donald Trump as well. And it would be true with regard to you if you were 78 years old and they put you in the White House for 4 more years, right? It's going to have an effect. As I say, it's hard to tell what the exact effect is, but you marry that with the problems that he's now facing. And it's not just poll numbers. The whole Iran issue, he must have many sleepless nights trying to think about how to deal with this, because he has boxed himself in. And I think this will affect him over time.
And if there's an accident or a miscalculation in the Persian Gulf on whoever's side, if you're an erratic character and you have a visceral interpretation of American honor and dignity as he sees it, who knows where that would lead to, John?
I think that's true. I think that's true with a president who's 45 years old. No. You remember John F. Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy, much to his credit, was fully aware that either he or Khrushchev could make a misstep and we could all end up in a nuclear war. And he wanted to do everything he could to get out of that situation before there was a major miscalculation. And fortunately, Khrushchev agreed with him. I think Khrushchev understood he had boxed himself in. Khrushchev in the Cuban Missile Crisis had boxed himself in. Kennedy appreciated that, and Kennedy helped Khrushchev walk himself out of that situation, and we all escaped. And I hope that, Trump doesn't do anything foolish.
Do you think then that Trump is capable of doing a Kennedy or a Khrushchev and give your enemy an avenue of escape?
I think he's capable of doing that. He's not a fool. He can be a wild and crazy guy, but he's not a fool most of the time. And I think that he will understand, and his advisors will understand what they have to do to get out of this box without a war. But again, as we said before, Tom, and I think this is pretty commonsensical at this point of view, he's going to have 2 choices here. One is go to war, right? Because the lobby will be putting great pressure on him. And furthermore, he'll think that his standing in the world and his standing in the country will depend on him showing that he's tough. That will be at play as well. So that's the argument for going. But then he will face a set of arguments against going, right, that we've been talking about just now. And the question you have to ask yourself is, which do you think he will choose? And, a number of people have asked me, what do I think he will do? And I tell them that I'm schizophrenic on the issue. One day I think he's going to go. The next day I think he's not going to go. It's just so hard to say.